Well, thank you all for coming, and we have put together, and we are happy to reveal for the first time in this format, the mayor's proposed budget for 2012 and 2013. I will give you a brief overview of the color and content of this budget, and then I intend to turn it over to Pete Previtera and others who can drill down further on it and give you much more specific detail, and we will be happy to respond to any questions or any further discussion you would like us to have regarding the budget. So I'm pleased to say that the budget process for us, anyway, is completed, and it's about to begin for the Board of Finance and the Board of Representatives. I am proposing a total operating budget of $483.3 million. What this represents is a $237.3 million funding for the Board of Education. That's 49% of the total. $201 million, or 42% of the total, for city operations, city departments, and $44.8 million, or 9% of the total budget, which will go toward funding city and education debt service obligations, the mortgages that the city holds, basically. Culmination of all revenue, expenditure, and reserve assumptions result in a proposed gross tax levy of 4.8%. However, due to a significant increase in the grand list, which was recently reported in the Stanford Advocate, thank you, Kate, we saw a 1.1% increase, or a $273.5 million increase in the grand list. That is a significant number if you consider what is happening in this economy and what's happening across the board in all other cities and towns in Connecticut, and probably consistently throughout all of New England. The grand lists in those areas have decreased. Stanford is unique in that its grand list has increased 1.1%. So with that in mind, the calculation is based on a change to the mill rate, and that change to the mill rate shows an average increase of 3.66 increase. Now, as you know, the mayor has no control or input over the Board of Education budget as it's being prepared. However, there is good news in that line as well. In the Board of Ed budget, there was a projection originally of an upwards of 10% increase in medical expenditures. Well, we found that we can actually reduce that number. The actual number can be reduced by $600,000. So I am recommending that that $600,000 be taken out of the Board of Ed budget, because indeed and in effect it is a savings.
You know what that would bring the percentage down to?
To the Board of Ed? 49%. It's really not going to...
10% medical expenditure.
Talking about the increase.
Yeah.
Right, roughly.
Well, brings it
down, but not, I mean, right now they're 3.49, that would bring them down to maybe 3.3%.
I was saying the 10% medical expenditure.
It's 600,000, John.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's less than a fraction of a percent.
How did you find that money? How did you determine that you can save that?
Pete did.
Yeah. I'll go through that.
He'll go through it.
Pete found the money.
Pete found the money, which he's very good at. So just to put things in perspective, the education budget submitted reflects an $8 million increase, or 3.5%. And the city side, the city operating budget, increased $6.8 million, or 3.5% on that end as well. Let's see. Debt service, unfortunately, increased by $2.2 million, or 5.2%. And the increase in debt service reflects the full annual cost of the recent $45 million general obligation bond sale to support infrastructure and capital improvements for education projects. Okay, Pete, can you take us through it?
Sure. Don't mind, I'm just going to stand up here. We're using high tech today. Go ahead. As the mayor pointed out, this is our current year adopted budget, 466.3. The mayor is proposing 483.3, it's a 17, and that number reflects their increase. When we went through the budget, we made some determinations. One is we had additional revenues that came in, full annualization of cost share increases for the retirees. We have a very well-reserved fund, meaning we have about a $6.4 million reserve level in our medical fund, which is probably twice as much as we need. So I'm taking $1 million out of that reserve fund and putting it towards the cost. And the third adjustment we made is we're making some assumptions on contract settlements. We've had a number of contract settlements. We've had custodians, we've had Teamsters, we have recently MAA, the attorneys, and I believe the dental hygienists. We're changing the medical plan as it exists right now, and we're pushing for this with all the unions in arbitration. Frankly, if you look at the medical budget, the gross budget is about $43 million. If you're looking at a 10% a year increase on the medical budget, it's not sustainable. I mean, you know, in the foreseeable future, you can do the math yourself and see how eventually, if nothing has changed, we'll be paying more for medical benefits than we will for salaries. So that's why we're pushing that. We made some assumptions in the medical budget that at some point in different times in next year's budget, we'll be settling with the majority of the unions, and we are going to see some savings. So roughly a $4.3 million increase was almost offset by either savings that we know of or savings we're projecting. I think the net increase in medical year over year on the city side was about $237,000. So basically, I informed the Board of Education we're not going to need that $600,000, and I told them that the mayor's going to make a recommendation to the Board of Finance to cut it. Once he cuts it, the increase will go down. We'll go down from 18 mils to 17.98 mils, or a 3.5% tax levy increase, mill rate increase. Excuse me. Go ahead, Jim. All right, change in the grand list. What does it mean? And Kate, I told Kate she did a great job on the article. We had an increase of $273 million. Now, that increase basically is generating almost $5 million in additional revenue. You know, that's why when we look at a year-over-year increase in the gross tax levy, even though the gross tax levy is going up, meaning we're taxing for a larger share, this increase mitigates what the actual residents and taxpayers are going to pay. That's why there's only a 3.5% increase in the mill rate. So I did some quick calculations. If we didn't have the grand list increase on a house of value at $400,000, the annual taxes would have been are $7,200. If we didn't have that increase and the budget stayed the way it is, residents could expect to pay $84 more on taxes. But again, if you apply this increase against the mill rate, you're looking at about $4.9 million in additional revenue. Go ahead. Now, what's driving these increases? As the mayor said, $8 million, a 3.5% increase on the Board of Education. City operating departments, a 3.5% increase, or $6.8 million. And debt service, $2.2 million, or a 5.2% increase. Now, what's driving on the city side, or actually on all sides? On the Board of Ed, the primary driver is the transition of grant-funded positions through the operating budget. I have an end of an era up here because it is an end of an era, only it's the American Resource and Recovery Act. That money is gone, so now they're transitioning positions over to the general fund. So that's a big part of their increase. On the city side, well, roughly it's about $335,000 on medical. Had we not had any offsets on the revenue side, this would have been about $4 million. Okay. Pensions, it's about a 10% increase, or $1.3 million. Frankly, I was expecting that number to come in higher, but the pension funds are doing better than we anticipated. The net fire plan, about $1,150,000, and we'll get into the net fire plan a little later. Net overtime, $1.4 million. What we're doing in this budget that's different from in the past is we're fully funding all the overtime obligations in police and fire in the operating budget. I don't know if you remember in the past, money was taken out and put in contingency, but now, if you look at the budget pages, you'll see we're fully funding overtime. This net represents the increase when we apply any payroll savings, any positions that were funded but we didn't fill last year. Radio maintenance, this is the first year we're hit with this liability. We basically have to pay for the maintenance of all communications and radio equipment in the city, which is significant. So that's $595,000. MSW is municipal solid waste. Now what this shows is last year when the budget was finally approved, there was a big cut to the MSW account. I think the rationale was that there was going to be greater savings due to recycling. We had some savings, but not to the magnitude as expected. So this $470,000 increase reflects what we think we're going to need this year to basically dispose of 50,000 tons of municipal solid waste. Leaf haulaway, $248,000. We had a composting operation up at Schofield Park. That is not going to be available. We have to basically budget for the haul away of these leaves. We're not going to be using that facility anymore, so that's what we expect it's going to cost us to take all those leaves away. And fuel increases, basically, we were fortunate enough to lock in very good rates on gasoline before the prices really went up. We locked in diesel as well, but we didn't have as good a luck on diesel fuel as we did on gasoline. So that reflects the net increase on fuel for gasoline and diesel. And debt service. As the mayor stated, we sold $45 million of bonds. We have one interest payment that's due. Next year we have two interest and one principal payment, which is spiking up our debt. The other thing that we're doing a little differently this year is we're breaking out the maturities for short-term capital. In the past, we would have level funding, level principal payments throughout the 20 years. Now what we're doing is whatever we have short-term, we're paying them off in 5 years. So you'll see it maybe $1 million spike per year for the first 5 years in debt service because we're paying those off early. Go ahead, Jim. Now, new positions. When you look at the budget book and you'll look at the change year over year, you're going to see roughly 15 new positions. But 9 of those positions were approved or in the process of being approved this year. The bolded positions are the actual new positions, and I'll go through all of them. We created a deputy assessor. There was a need for that position, in that department. With reval, with the workload in that area, a determination was made that needed to happen. A GIS analyst. That position is a new position in the new year budget. A couple years ago, we eliminated a GIS position. We made a determination with everything that's going on with us in the city and mapping requirements that we have and we need to take into consideration. It was imperative that we hired another GIS analyst. A mason. Now, that position, we have some issues with stormwater and catch basins. We had a contractor that we had hired to go out and fix all these. We didn't think it was cost effective to have a contractor do this because there's always a substantial amount of work in that area, so a determination was made it was cheaper to hire our own staff, so we have a mason. Plan review coordinator. In the engineering department, obviously the purpose of this position is to speed plan review along. Once plans are reviewed, once they're approved, once the building permits are out there, it just speeds up the process and work gets done a lot quicker. Police Department Fleet Foreman. Currently there is a sergeant who is the fleet foreman for the police department, and frankly, we made a determination that we should civilianize that position and put that sergeant back out in the field if that's possible. So, we're hoping to do that. The next 4 positions are for Smith House: an executive director, a finance manager, a nursing director, and an admissions manager. The model we're using right now at Smith House is we have a management firm who basically provides all these people for us. They manage Smith House. As you know, we've had some issues with finances at Smith House, and there's a team that was put together consisting of myself, the HR director, the health director, the director of public safety, the controller, along with the board directors at the Smith House. And we're trying to come up with a new approach to Smith House that would basically be a more proactive approach in terms of collections, of filling beds, of being more proactive in advertising and promoting the facility. So a decision was made to go back to this model where these 4 positions will be city positions now. And we're in the process of getting approval to hire an executive director and follow through with the other positions once that is approved. And that item is on the agenda for tonight's Board of Finance meeting, so we'll find out, if they support that or not tonight. 2 health inspectors were approved this year. They're already filled. Restaurant inspections, all sorts of inspections. Again, we eliminated a number of positions over the last 2 years, and now, we feel that in some cases we may have gone too deep, and now we're bringing these people back. The health account clerk, that was just a labor settlement. We eliminated a position. We had someone else doing it part-time that was grieved. The settlement was we had to put that position back on payroll. The health lab tech, that is a technician that's going to be doing the well water testing in North Stamford, and that was approved by the board this year. Human resources generalist is funded for 3/4 of a year. Not too long ago we had 3 human resource generalists in HR, and now we have 1. Believe it or not, even when you're not hiring people, there's a lot of work that goes on down there in terms of testing, and a wide variety of issues come up. So it was determined that we needed to bolster that staff, so we're adding a second HR generalist. And in the mayor's office, we're adding an additional executive secretary because there's a tremendous amount of work that comes out of the mayor's office, and we felt that was warranted. So actually, there are 6 new positions. 9 of these positions were either approved or pending approval in the current year budget. Go ahead, Jim. All right, police department. We have a class of 10 funded to start September 1st, 2012. And the reason we're starting them in September is because it was brought to our attention that most classes start after the summer is over. Otherwise, we would have funded it for a full year, but that seemed reasonable to us. Overtime is funded at $380,000 per month based on their current staffing, the positions that they have in the pipeline now to hire, the new class that we have for next year, and I'll get into the laterals. We feel that that is a sustainable budget for the police department. We don't have a contingency reserve for overtime because we're fully funding them in their operating budget. And again, if you think last year we funded 3/4 of the overtime for police and 3/4 of the overtime for fire, so now we're fully funding them, and we're still only up 3.5% on a year-to-year basis on city departments. I think that's pretty significant. Immediate lateral hires as available. A lateral hire is a post-certified police officer that's already working in another community who may be looking to move. We've basically told Chief Nivikoff, whenever you have an opportunity to identify a lateral hire or someone who is already certified, who wants to come work in the city of Stamford, you have our authority to go ahead and hire them. Any lateral hire, the training time is what, a month, 6 weeks, as opposed to 8 months for our new recruits. They would have an immediate impact on our overtime. So we basically notified the chief that when he identifies those people, and notify me, and we'll make arrangements to move money out of overtime to pay for them. We have an additional $200,000 in overtime identified for special units and training to deal with homeland security issues. I already talked about the increase in radio maintenance and emergency communication. And the last item here, an annual hiring program. One of the concerns we have is that every year we run up against the same issue. When are we going to hire police officers to offset our rate of attrition? We had a discussion with the police chief, and one of the concerns, it's really a fiscal concern, it's expensive to run an academy. So we said to the chief, why don't you talk to the chiefs in the area, see if we can arrange something where we'd have a rotating academy. Maybe one year it's in New Haven, another year it's in Bridgeport, another year it's in Stamford, so we can share the cost, because running an academy is extremely expensive. So he's going to be exploring that possibility. Go ahead, Jim. The Stamford Fire Plan. Now, Stamford Fire and Rescue overtime is fully funded at $85.6 thousand per week for overtime. Now, that's significant because we're not cutting the overtime budget for Stamford Fire and Rescue. We're fully funding them. We're fully funding the existing staffing levels that they have. However, we're not funding for any vacant line positions. We're not adding any new positions. And I'll get into that in the fire plan. Volunteer fire departments are funded for 3 fiscal quarters at their current level plus 10%. If you recall, we have a line item in the budget, and we have Belltown, Turner River, Long Ridge, and Springdale, thank you, Jim, that traditionally we give them an allocation on a quarterly basis, and now what we're doing is we're saying, we're giving you that same allocation for the first 3 quarters, and we recognize that you've had some funding issues this year and in the past, so the mayor has increased that by 10%. And then we have the volunteer fire plan funded at about $1.7 million for the last fiscal quarter. Go ahead, Jim. This represents the funding for the volunteer departments. As you can see, we have 3 quarters of funding, as I described. In the last quarter, will be funding for the Stanford Volunteer Fire Department. The only department that's not part of this is Glenbrook. Glenbrook will continue to operate the same way they have with quarterly payments, and they're being increased by 10% as well. Now, what is this fire plan? What's this $1.7 million? Basically, a rough breakdown is there's about $1 million for salaries, about $350,000 for benefits, and about $350,000 for operating expenses. We're assuming that it's going to take the Stanford Volunteer Fire Department time to ramp up and do their hiring and be ready for the 4th quarter when we're assuming they're going to become fully operational. Now, in terms of what does that mean? The plan calls for 58 paid firefighters. Right now there are 8 in Long Ridge, so they're going to have to hire 50 additional firefighters. In terms of deployment, right now that's a work in process, because during the day they're probably going to have 3 firefighters on per shift. During the evening it's going to be less, and during the weekend it's going to be less, because the assumption is that they're going to have volunteers to fill those gaps. But the Director of Public Safety is working with them to work out the necessary breakdown of the staffing requirements. But again, one of the reasons why we didn't reduce the Stanford Fire Department overtime budget, well, there's 2 reasons. One reason is because we wanted to make sure there was adequate fire coverage during the transition period. We wanted to make sure that Stanford Fire and Rescue was still on duty in the districts with the apparatus where they are, while this new volunteer fire department company ramped up. And the second issue is, right now the Stanford Fire Department is currently working under an existing bargaining unit agreement. That agreement calls for minimum manning requirements, and it calls for a minimum apparatus to be available. Now, we're making an assumption that contract is either going to be settled or arbitrated by a certain point in time next fiscal year. Now, if it's not, we're still obligated to fund them at the current level. So it made no sense for us, number 1, to cut overtime with the contract still being out there, and number 2, to cut overtime with this transition in play. So that's basically the plan. Hire 58, well, there's already 8 of them, hire additional 50 firefighters, provide funding for those firefighters, give the department 3 quarters to ramp up and be ready for a transition in the last quarter, and then work out the deployment based on the availability of volunteers. Go ahead. Operations. Just the snow account, we basically budget that on an average of over a 5-year period of time. All the vacant positions are funded. There's a few that are funded for part of the work year. I talked about the MSW tonnage at 50 tons. Special events is fully funded at $100,000, but there's no fireworks in this budget. I talked about the new mason position for catch basins. It's basically, there's a responsibility that we have there's a DEEP consent order that we have to be in compliance with, and the mason on the catch basin issue is going to be working on that. We talked about the plan review position. For those of you who like to take the tram at Cove Island, the tram is back in the budget. You don't like to walk to the beach from the parking lot, now you can ride. And there's additional funds for more lifeguards. Now, the lifeguards issue was brought to my attention by Lori Albano, the supervisor of Parks and Rec. What she told me was that there's an additional beach area that's being opened up for usage, and they were concerned about lifeguard coverage at those beaches, at 2 beaches, and also at Hero Park. So, you know, we agreed to put additional money in for lifeguards as a, you know, precautionary measure. It's a safety issue as far as we're concerned. Go ahead, Jim. Other department changes. No real change in admin, no real change in HR legal, appointed elected. Outside agencies. The mayor's increased the allocation to the Ferguson Library by $140,000. So they're going from $7 million to $7,140,000. Stanford Museum from $1 million to $1,020,000. Mill River Collaborative, you know, an additional $25,000, I think, from $125 to $150. The mayor included $15,000 for Multicultural Council of Stanford, and an additional increase of $15,000 to St. Luke's Life Works. And again, you know, in some cases, you know, the mayor has had direct conversation with directors from these organizations, and basically they've been cut back over a number of years, and they're viable and important institutions in the city, and the mayor felt compelled to try to offset some of their increasing operating costs by giving them additional funding. On the revenue side, we had an increase in supplemental auto. Again, you know, as I said before, the number of automobiles has actually declined, but the value of the existing automobiles is increased because people are trading up to newer vehicles. So we're reflecting that increase. A decrease in interest income, that's not a surprise. I've been reporting that on every quarterly report I have. You know, we have $125,000 in the budget. You know, there is no interest to be made out there on short-term cash investments. We have a net increase in revenues. Now, we did receive an additional $900,000 plus in ECS in the governor's proposed budget. There were some offsets to that, so we're assuming a net increase of about $739,000 on government aid. Now, we had a drop in building permits. Building permits is a tough call to make, only because there can be a lot of plans on the board to move forward, but you never know when a developer is going to pull back for whatever reason. If it's cash flow, whatever reason is out there. So we try to be a little conservative in our planning for building permits. So this was a decision that was based on a conversation I had with the chief building official, that we felt that we needed to drop that down a little. You know, we're doing good on recycling. We're doing great on recycling. You know, our recycling efforts are increasing, and we do have a contract with a company that takes away our recyclables and basically pays us for it. Smith House revenues, we're showing basically a $1.3 million operating loss in next year for Smith House, meaning the taxpayers are picking up the difference between what it costs to operate Smith House and what revenues come in. And again, it's a larger increase. Personally, I think that the revenue estimates provided by our outside consultant for the current year were a little aggressive, but I think we're being a little more conservative now in our estimating on revenues on Smith House. Drop in the sale of surplus property. As I said to the mayor earlier, we sold everything that isn't nailed down that we could sell, all old vehicles, old equipment. You know, we basically have a decent revenue item coming in this year for sale of surplus property. But even with that, you know, whenever we have old vehicles or old trucks, old equipment, we're selling them all now, and we're doing it online on an online auction, and we're seeing great results on it. A drop in the enterprise zone reimbursement. That's a program for the enterprise zone where companies come in and they get a tax break. But what this means is if there's a drop in the reimbursement, that means they're paying full taxes now. So there's a good effect to this. And an increase in cost allocation payments. Cost allocation payments are what we charge other agencies like the WPCA or the golf course or the marina for the usage of city operations like purchasing, budgeting, HR, you know, all those types of support services. So that reflects an increase in the cost allocation payments. Go ahead, Jim. Reserve changes. These are the reserves that when we come up with a budget, we come up with a tax rate for the budget, and then we have to budget for these reserves as well. Reserve for tax appeals going up $750,000. Basically, the tax collector recommended we put that in there as part of his plan to settle all of the old disputed assessment claims that are still out there. I think there's about $4.8 million that are still out there. Reserve for Mill River and reserve for Harbor Point. Basically, that's a function of the assessed value going up in those districts, specifically in Harbor Point. When the assessor assesses the property in Harbor Point, he's assessing the whole property. But the agreement we have on the TIF is that, they get 50% of the incremental tax increase. So what we have to do is we have to make sure we reserve for that, because that money is going back to Harbor Point, and that's what that's there for. Reserve for uncollected, that's just a calculation based on, we assume a 98.5% collection rate, but we have to tax it 100%. That's just an adjustment to the collection, to the reserve collection adjustment. Thank you. Reserve for linkage, this money goes into the housing fund. Basically, we're taking a portion of building permits that meet certain requirements, and we're taking that money out and putting it into the housing fund. And reserve for contingency, we have about $4.2 million in contingency. That's going up $431,000 over the current year, and there are a number of items in contingency that are either wage-related or non-wage related, and I really don't think I need to get into that right now. So the total increase in reserves is $3 million. Go ahead, Jim. That's it for the operating. I'll give you a quick few slides on the capital, and then I'll answer any questions you have. The capital budget, the gross budget, 57.1, less grant funding, less other self-supporting debt, 34.6. I believe the planning board recommended around a $39 million budget, so we sat down and we made some adjustments to it. The Board of Finance recommended a safe debt limit of $35 million. We're within their limit. I think in the mayor's transmittal we pointed out that even though we're coming in at $34.6 million, when we sell bonds next year, we may ask for the approval of the Board of Finance to sell a greater amount of bonds, only because we have a number of old projects that still need to be addressed. Now that we're on this project-specific bonding, if every year, if we sell bonds equal to what's in the capital budget, we'll never catch up to the backlog of old projects. But in this case, we're submitting a budget that falls within the safe debt limit by the Board of Finance. Go ahead. Here's a breakdown by activity, housing, education. I mean, obviously the largest piece of this is Operation Public Works, streets, sidewalks, buildings, public safety short term, and then WPC as part of that as well. Go ahead. And the last one is by category. Again, you can see that between infrastructure and building, road infrastructure and building infrastructure, that's a significant amount of the $57 million. Excuse me.